There is a dog, a very specific kind of dog, trained by the United States Coast Guard to find what water tries to hide. On the morning of April 16th, 2026, that dog was on the ground in Hopetown, Elbow Cay, Bahamas, walking the same shoreline, sniffing the same brush, working a route that 12 days earlier, a woman named Lynette Hooker was supposed to have survived. The cadaver dog doesn't know what Brian Hooker told investigators. It doesn't know about the 9-hour drift, or the flotation device, or the account that has produced more questions than answers since the moment investigators first heard it. The dog just works. It follows what it smells. And in cases like this one, what those dogs find or don't find tells investigators something that no account, no statement, no attorney press release ever can. 12 days. That's how long it took from the night of April 4th to the moment that K-9 team set foot on Elbow Cay. 12 days of aerial surveillance, sea patrols, submersible drones, shoreline sweeps by hand. 12 days of Darlene Hamlet, 76 years old, waiting by the phone in Michigan. 12 days of Carly Aylesworth telling anyone who would listen that her mother could have swum 2 feet to shore. 12 days, and the only physical evidence recovered was a flotation device. One flotation device, which Brian says he threw to Lynette after she went in. That's it. In nearly 2 weeks of professional searching across the Sea of Abaco, that is the only confirmed physical piece of evidence. And now there is a cadaver dog walking the ground where this happened, and somewhere out there is a mystery sailboat whose owners the Coast Guard just went public, asking the world to help them find. I'm your lead narrative architect at Redacted Files Lab. This is the Lynette Hooker case, and today I want to do something I haven't done in a full video yet. I want to walk you through the last night, step by step, stop by stop, using the documented timeline of where Brian and Lynette actually were before she disappeared. Because when you lay it out that way, some details hit very differently. Subscribe to Redacted Files Lab before we go any further. This case is moving right now. The Coast Guard went public this week with a new appeal. There are active interviews being conducted by federal investigators as of the time of this recording, and there is a witness or a set of witnesses potentially sitting somewhere in the world right now who were moored right next to Soulmate on the night of April 4th and may not even know investigators are looking for them. Let me start with the morning of April 4th, because that's where the day actually begins, and the day matters. Soulmate, Brian and Lynette's 45-foot catamaran, was moored in Aunt Pat's Bay off Elbow Cay. Aunt Pat's Bay is a popular anchorage, well protected, the kind of spot that attracts live aboard sailors and cruisers moving through the Abaco Island chain. On that particular day, according to sources close to the investigation and confirmed by the Coast Guard's own public appeal, at least one other sailboat was moored nearby, right there alongside Soulmate. Close enough that its occupants would have had a direct view of the boat and potentially of anything that happened on or around it. That sailboat has not been identified. The Coast Guard posted 2 grainy photographs of it publicly this week and posted to social media. CGIS is looking for the owner of the sailboat moored near the SV Soulmate. A statement obtained by CBS News put it even more plainly. The owners and occupants of that vessel, the memo says, may have information relevant to the CGIS investigation. Think about what that means. A month after Lynette disappeared, the criminal investigative arm of the United States Coast Guard is telling the public there were witnesses. We just don't know who they are yet. Now let's walk through the day. April 4th, Elbow Cay. Hopetown is a small village on the Cay, known for its red and white striped lighthouse, its harbor, its New England feel transplanted to the tropics. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where the same boats sit at the same docks every season, and where a couple like Brian and Lynette would be recognized as regulars, as live-aboards, as part of the extended community of people who have made the Abacos their floating home. That evening, Brian and Lynette went to the Abaco Inn for drinks. This is confirmed. The Abaco Inn sits on the harbor side of Elbow Cay, a low-key bar and restaurant with a dock and an ocean view. Fox News Digital sent a charter captain named Mo Monestein, who has spent 15 years working those waters, to physically retrace the route Brian described. Monestein started at the harbor across from the Abaco Inn, because that's where Brian and Lynette would have launched their dinghy to head back to Soulmate. The route from the Abaco Inn harbor to the anchorage at Aunt Pat's Bay is not complicated. You clear the harbor entrance, turn southwest, and run the channel between the western coast of Elbow Cay and the eastern shore of Lubber's Quarters. It's protected water. It's a route both of them had done dozens of times. Monestein ran it for the cameras. 4 minutes. The ride from the harbor to the anchorage took 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Brian and Lynette left the Abaco Inn at roughly 7:30 in the evening. The sun had just gone down, Brian said in the recorded phone call he made to a friend on April 7th, before he was arrested, before attorneys told him to stop talking, that the sun had set approximately 10 minutes before Lynette went overboard. He described the conditions. 20-something knot winds, he said, that popped up suddenly. Choppy water. He said she basically just bounced off the dinghy in the middle of a little blow. Bounced. That's the word he used. She bounced off. In that same call, obtained by CBS News, Brian filled in more detail. He said the dinghy key went overboard with Lynette because it wasn't clipped to anything. He also said Lynette had the spare key in her dry bag, which was with her in the water. So both keys, he says, were gone. He threw the anchor out and yelled. He said he couldn't see her because the moon hadn't risen yet. He said he thought she was swimming towards Soulmate, which he estimated was about 1,000 yards from where the incident happened. 1,000 yards. That is more than half a mile. Carly Aylesworth, Lynette's daughter, retraced the route herself. She flew to the Bahamas and walked the ground, went out on the water, stood at the spot. She told Wood TV when she came home that the story sounds more sketchy to her now than it did before she left. And here's the specific thing she said that I keep coming back to. She said her mother could have swum 2 feet to shore from where she went in. She looked at the distance and said 2 feet, not 1,000 yards to Soulmate, 2 feet to land. Carly also said something that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention in the broader coverage. She noted that Brian is an ex-Marine. He's trained in water survival. He knows how to navigate open water, how to manage panic, how to get to shore in conditions that would overwhelm most people. And she asked, directly, why he didn't swim to find her, why he paddled a dinghy for 9 hours instead of going into the water himself to search for his wife. His attorney has not provided a specific answer to that question. Subscribe to Redacted Files Lab. I have the full investigative breakdown of this case across multiple videos, and the developments are coming fast. If you've been watching this since the beginning, you know there are multiple threads here, and this week opened 2 new ones simultaneously. Let me talk about the flotation device, because it's the one piece of physical evidence that connects what Brian says happened to what investigators actually found on the water. Brian says, in a voicemail he left for Carly that she shared with CNN, that Hopetown Search and Rescue found a flotation device that he threw to Lynette when she went overboard. The voicemail, which he left the day after the incident, was strangely calm. Carly told CNN that when Brian called her Sunday evening to tell her mother was missing, he was matter-of-fact about it. She described it as him dropping a bomb and then just moving on. He said Lynette had been missing since the night before. He said they didn't know where she was. He mentioned they would come see Carly soon. Soon. His wife had been in the water since the previous night, and he was talking about coming to see her daughter soon. The flotation device was recovered somewhere in the search area, but the precise location has not been publicly confirmed in detail. What has been confirmed by Commissioner of Police Shanta Knowles, who told NBC News directly, is that it remains the only piece of physical evidence recovered in the entire search operation. One flotation device. From an 8-foot dinghy that allegedly had 2 people on it, launched from a harbor in conditions Brian describes as rough enough to throw Lynette off the boat. Here's what a forensic nurse expert named Rachel Fisher, who has no connection to the case, told News Nation this week. She said that in cases like this, investigators have to evaluate whether the search area is consistent with the conditions at the time. If you're told someone went overboard at a specific location in specific conditions, you can run environmental modeling to predict where the person or their effects should end up. If expected evidence isn't recovered, Fisher said, that doesn't automatically establish an alternative scenario, but it does require investigators to reassess whether all assumptions about location and sequence are accurate. Let me say that one more time in plain terms. If what Brian described is true, the physical evidence should be somewhere predictable, based on the currents and the wind that night. And if the physical evidence that has been found doesn't match what the conditions would produce, that's a question. That question doesn't answer itself. It just tells investigators they need to look harder at the assumptions. One flotation device, 30-plus days of professional searching, no remains, no personal effects. No secondary evidence that places Lynette in the water at the location Brian described. Now I want to come back to the mystery sailboat, because this is the development that hit me hardest this week, and I want to be specific about why. Aunt Pat's Bay, where Soulmate was moored on April 4th, is an anchorage. Sailors stop there. Boats come and go. On any given night in the Abacos during sailing season, there could be several vessels anchored in close proximity. The whole anchorage culture means you are not alone. You hear things. You see things. Your boat is 20 or 30 feet from other boats, and sounds carry on water at night in a way that they don't on land. Somebody was anchored right next to Soulmate that day. The Coast Guard has photographs, grainy images pulled from what sounds like the kind of automated recording that some boats and dock cameras generate. Not high quality, but enough to show the vessel, enough to know it was there. And its owners have not come forward. That could mean anything. It could mean they don't know investigators are looking for them. It could mean they've left the Bahamas, gone back to whatever country they sailed from, and haven't seen the news. It could mean they're somewhere without reliable internet, and the Coast Guard's appeal simply hasn't reached them yet. The sailing community in the Abacos is international. That boat could be registered anywhere, or it could mean something else. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when the criminal investigative arm of the United States Coast Guard goes public, over a month after the incident, seeking witnesses who were physically present at the last confirmed location where Brian and Lynette were together before she disappeared, that is a significant investigative move. You don't do that unless you believe those witnesses matter. You don't post grainy photographs to social media and ask the public to help identify a boat unless you've already exhausted your other options for finding it through official channels. They need those witnesses. The question is why. There are a few possibilities worth thinking through carefully. The first is that investigators believe Soulmate's occupants may have been observed in the hours before Brian and Lynette left for the Abaco Inn. If the neighboring boat was anchored close enough, its occupants might have overheard arguments, seen interactions, noticed something about the mood or the dynamic before that dinghy left the dock. The second is that investigators believe something happened near Soulmate, not just in the open water where Brian says Lynette went overboard. Federal investigators have been looking, according to a CBS News report citing sources close to the investigation, beyond the dinghy route described in earlier accounts. They are looking at what happened before Brian and Lynette even got in that dinghy. The appeal for information is centered on Aunt Pat's Bay on April 4th. The whole day, not just the moment the dinghy departed. The third possibility is the simplest one. The mystery sailboat's owners were simply there. They were present. They saw the dinghy leave. They may have heard or seen something that confirms or contradicts the account Brian gave to investigators, and in a case that so far has only one physical piece of evidence, a witness who saw the dinghy depart, who can say what the conditions were like, who can describe what they heard or observed in the hours around 7:30 p.m. That night is potentially invaluable. If you are the owner of that sailboat, or if you know who was anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay near a 45-foot catamaran called Soulmate on April 4th, 2026, the Coast Guard needs to hear from you. The CGIS TIPS application is available on any phone, iOS or Android. Tips can be submitted anonymously. I want to talk about the Navionics screenshot now, because it's a detail that came out early in this investigation, and I don't think it's gotten the scrutiny it deserves. Navionics is a navigation application, a digital charting tool that serious sailors use to track their routes, plan passages, and log their movements on the water. Brian Hooker had Navionics on his devices, and at some point after the incident, Brian took a screenshot from Navionics that purportedly showed the route the dinghy took on the night of April 4th. That screenshot was obtained by CBS News. Think about that for a second. In the immediate aftermath of his wife going overboard, after 9 hours of drifting, after finding a boatyard at 4 a.m, after contacting authorities, and somewhere in the sequence of events that followed, Brian Hooker opened his navigation app and took a screenshot of the route. He documented the route. That is either exactly what a careful, tech-oriented sailor would do to help investigators understand what happened, or it is something else entirely. The devices seized from Soulmate include digital tablets and cell phone-related equipment. Whatever Brian accessed in the hours and days between the incident and the search warrant, investigators have a record of it. a man who spent a career in telecommunications, who wired his own boat's solar system, who his friend Blaine Stevenson describes as knowing more about maritime electronics than most people who sail those same waters. That man knows exactly what his devices are recording about his activity. The screenshot exists. Investigators have it. What it actually shows and what it doesn't show is something only investigators know right now. Stevenson, who knew Brian from the sailing community, recorded the phone call Brian made to him on April 7th. He published it after Brian's arrest. In that call, Brian described the events of that night in detail. He described the conditions. He described losing sight of Lynette. He described his attempts to reach her. And Stevenson, who has since publicly urged Brian to be more forthcoming, told CBS News this week what he genuinely believes. He said Lynette's family trusted Brian with their loved one. "You didn't live up to it," Stevenson said, referring to the message he sent Brian directly. "So now's the time for you to live up to that and take care of them and give them the answers they're looking for." Stevenson was there at the beginning. He recorded the call, he said, because he wanted the sailing community to be able to evaluate the account. He has since made public his view that Brian owes that family an explanation. He hasn't called Brian a killer. He is asking him to be more forthcoming. That is a man who knows this person, who spoke to him days after the incident, who has sat with everything he heard and decided that something in what he was told doesn't line up. Let me talk about the 24 hours after Brian arrived at the boatyard, because the timeline of what Brian did and said in the immediate aftermath is something that investigators and Lynette's family have scrutinized closely. He arrived at the Marsh Harbor boatyard at roughly 4 a.m. on April 5th. He contacted authorities. Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue launched a search. Up to that point, the account follows its own logic, even if its investigators have questions about the overall story. But on Sunday evening, roughly 18 hours after Lynette went into the water, Brian called Carly, his stepdaughter, Lynette's daughter, and Carly told CNN exactly how that conversation went. He said, matter of fact, "Hey, your mom is missing. We don't know where she is. She's been missing since last night, but we're going to come up there soon to see you." She said it felt like he dropped a bomb and then just kept talking. She said she was left thinking, "How do you just lose my mom?" Then Brian left a voicemail later that same day about the flotation device. Calm, measured, reporting information the way you report information to someone you're going to see soon. The next morning, April 6th, Brian gave a statement to CNN. "I am heartbroken over the recent boat accident," the statement said. He described unpredictable seas and high winds. He described desperate attempts to reach her. He said finding her was his sole focus. On April 8th, 4 days after the incident, Brian Hooker was arrested and taken into custody by the Royal Bahamas Police Force. On April 13th, he was released. His Bahamian attorney, Terrell Butler, stood outside and said they had no evidence and no choice but to release him. On April 14th, Brian told ABC News his sole focus was finding his wife, no matter how likely or unlikely that is. He said, "My only focus is to go back to the boat, and then hire or beg people to help me go find some areas to search." Hours after that interview, Brian Hooker left the Bahamas. His attorney said he wanted to be with his terminally ill mother. He left the Bahamas. The day after he said finding his wife was his only focus, he left. And since then he has been in the United States, represented by a Michigan attorney, declining interview requests, while the Coast Guard and the Royal Bahamas Police Force continue investigating. None of that proves anything. People have complicated, contradictory, grief-fractured responses to traumatic events. His mother is ill. His own situation was legally precarious. Staying in the Bahamas as a named, uncharged suspect with attorneys advising him would be complicated for anyone. I understand all of that, but I'm laying the timeline out exactly as the documented record shows it, and I'll let you sit with it. Subscribe to Redacted Files Lab. This is the case I come back to every time I think I'm done with it, because it keeps producing new developments. The mystery sailboat is new. The federal interviews CBS News confirmed are happening this week are new. Whatever those seized devices are telling investigators is new, even if we don't know the contents. This is not a closed file. Now I want to bring in something that surfaced in a CBS News report that I think deserves its own moment. CBS uncovered text messages that Lynette sent to someone, the identity of the recipient not publicly confirmed, where she wrote, It was real bad. I can't be out there with him. We do not have the full context of those messages. We don't know when they were sent, what specific incident prompted them, or exactly what real bad referred to. But they are real. They exist. They are part of the documentary record that investigators have access to. A woman out on the water with the man she'd been living with for a decade, writing to someone and saying she can't be out there with him. That sentence has been sitting with me since I first read it. Carly Aylesworth told Fox News that Brian had, on occasions, threatened to throw Lynette overboard. She told NBC News that he had choked her mother. She described a pattern of escalating conflict, especially when alcohol was involved. She was careful in how she said it, but she was clear. This was not a description of a perfect marriage fraying under the pressure of close-quarter sailing. It was a description of something more specific than that. Brian's attorneys have pushed back hard on every allegation. Crystal Marie Hauser, his Michigan attorney, told ABC News there is absolutely no evidence to support any of the allegations, absolutely none. Terrell Butler said Brian was confronted with Carly's claims during questioning and disputed them. And Brian himself said publicly he never harmed Lynette and never would have. The 2015 police report from Kentwood, Michigan exists in the public record. Both Lynette and Brian were involved in a physical altercation. Lynette was arrested. But Lynette, according to the officer who responded and noted she appeared intoxicated, told police that Brian had struck her and choked her. The prosecutor reviewed the case and found insufficient evidence to establish who started it. It was dismissed. What we have is a documented incident, a daughter describing a pattern, private text messages from Lynette herself, and a husband who has maintained his innocence from the moment he arrived at the boatyard at 4 a.m. The question of which of those things carries more weight is one that investigators are working through right now. Not commentators, not podcasters, not me. Investigators, with access to everything that was seized from Soulmate, with interviews being conducted this week, with a cadaver dog that has already been on the ground and may be deployed again. Forensic nurse Rachel Fisher, the expert who spoke to News Nation this week, said something that I think cuts through a lot of the noise around this case. She said that conclusions aren't based on theory or opinion. They're based on whether independent sources of evidence, physical findings, digital data, environmental conditions, and verified timelines converge on a single consistent explanation. Until that alignment occurs, the investigation remains focused on testing each element of the reported narrative against the available evidence. That's not dramatic language. It's not podcast speculation. That's what this process actually looks like from the inside. You take the account you've been given, you test it against every independent source you have, and you see whether the story holds up. And when something doesn't hold up, you note it, and you investigate further. There are things in Brian's account that investigators have been testing for over a month. The 9-hour drift, the lanyard on Lynette, the fact that the anchorage was, by his own account, about 1,000 yards from where she went in. The route from there to the Marsh Harbor boatyard, which is not a straight line from where the incident allegedly happened, the timing of his calls to Carly, the screenshot, the devices, and now as of this week there is a new element being tested, the mystery sailboat. Whoever was on that boat saw something or didn't see something. Either way, they were there, and what they tell investigators will either corroborate the account or it won't. Here's the detail I want to leave you with today. The one that doesn't get mentioned as often as it should. When the cadaver dog team from the U.S. Coast Guard was deployed to Hopetown on April 16th, they weren't just doing a sweep of the shoreline. They were retracing the route, the last known route that Lynette Hooker walked before getting into that dinghy, the Abaco Inn, the dock, the water between the harbor and Aunt Pat's Bay, the shoreline of Lauber's quarters, the areas around the anchorage. A cadaver dog doesn't respond to living people. It doesn't respond to clothing or personal effects or a flotation device thrown into the water. It responds to one specific thing. And deploying one along the route Brian and Lynette took on April 4th tells you something about where investigators think this case might lead. Whether the dog found anything that day has not been publicly confirmed. What has been confirmed is that it was there. The Coast Guard was there. The investigation was there, in the actual physical location, running the actual route, 30 days later. And somewhere out there is a sailboat whose owners were anchored right next to Soulmate that night, watching or not watching, hearing or not hearing, not knowing maybe that the federal government wants to talk to them. If that's you, Or if you know who it is, the Coast Guard Investigative Service needs to hear from you. The CGIS Tips app is on any phone. Anonymous submission is an option. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. His attorneys state he categorically and unequivocally denies any wrongdoing. All individuals referenced in this video are presumed innocent unless formally charged and convicted in a court of law. Both the U.S. Coast Guard criminal investigation and the Royal Bahamas Police Force investigation remain active. Lynette Hooker has been missing since April 4th, 2026. She was 55 years old. She was from Onstead, Michigan. She lived on the water because she loved it. Her mother is waiting. Subscribe to Redacted Files Lab. This case is still moving. The question of what happened on that dinghy, in the dark, between Hopetown and Aunt Pat's Bay, has not been answered, and someone out there knows what that sailboat saw.